Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the Saints Insider Podcast for Tuesday, August the 22nd. I'm Zach Ewing, joined by Luke Johnson, Jeff Duncan, and Rod Walker as usual. Luke and Jeff are back from their adventure in LA. There was a hurricane, or I guess, did it ever hit hurricane or just tropical storm by the time it was in LA? I don't know. And an earthquake and a preseason game. So that's like the natural disaster trifecta. They made it home. The Saints made it home. The Saints won another preseason game, Luke. So how was that experience?
Well, it's certainly the first time in my life, and probably in a lot of people's lives, they were both under a tropical storm warning and getting alerts on their phone for an earthquake in the area. I mean, honestly, like, how many times in recorded history has that happened? Probably not very frequently. We did get up there and cover a game, and I think we saw a lot of the things we wanted to see outside of the starters, which probably people don't want to see the starters playing the preseason games. So, I came away from that thinking, I was impressed with some of the play by the defenders. I was impressed with Jalen Smith, who got a chance to get in there with the starting defense, and I think played pretty well. He had two big plays on third down. I think they, from a run defense standpoint, played a little bit better this week outside of the quarterback runs, which can kind of continue to burn them. I thought Jake Haener kind of bounced back from a little bit of a shaky performance in week one and really showed some of the things that, kind of made us excited about in the first couple of weeks of training camp.
Yeah, let's talk a minute about the quarterbacks, Duncan, and I want to get your impressions too of what it was like being there. But, I don't think either quarterback played poorly. We did see some of the same concerns with Jameis Winston, maybe holding the ball too long. Maybe that's an offensive line issue. As Dennis Allen said after the first preseason game, it's usually a little bit of blame to go around. Jake Haener had one really impressive attempt on his first throw and then wasn't asked to do a ton after he left the game with that concussion scare. So what were your impressions?
Yeah, look, I think we got the whole Jameis Winston experiment in that first half, right? I mean, he made an incredible throw down the sideline on a wheel route to Kendre Miller, made a couple other brilliant throws that I don't think a lot of quarterbacks would even attempt, but he's got such confidence that he'll put the ball in there. And then you get some of those what the heck is he doing throws that have kind of been the trademark of Jameis Winston's career. And I think it's probably why he's a backup now. So, I think the offensive line issues you can just say are attributable to him playing with a lot of backups. He doesn't get a lot of help in that regard. He's certainly not playing with the frontline receivers. But I do think there's, a legitimate conversation about what the Saints do at the backup quarterback position, because he has not had an overall very good camp. He's had some highlight throws, but overall, I don't think you could feel real confident in Jameis Winston leading this team if Derek Carr were to go down. I've talked to Luke about this as well. I mean, the Taysom Hill factor gives the Saints front office and the brass some options, because he is a guy that has proven he can win games, at least in a short period of time, as a cameo role as the starting quarterback. And the Saints have that luxury if they don't feel confident that Jake Haener could step right in, which I certainly don't think Dennis Allen, being as conservative as he is, would want to hand the keys to him. But he's got a lot of potential down the road. I think as a developmental prospect. But if you're talking about the backup right now, I think serious question marks with Jameis Winston.
Yeah, and Rod, you were not in LA, but obviously watched the game. And we're going to talk roster cuts, and we're a week away from the Saints having to go down from 90 to 53. It's all in one go this year. It's obviously you got to cut, more than a third of your players. So it's a big cut. A lot of guys are going to go. Obviously, Jameis Winston's not going to go at that point. But is there a long-term conversation there?
I think there may be a long-term conversation. And I think if the Saints had to play a game tomorrow without Derek Carr, I think, Jameis is definitely your guy. I think he has the experience. And, he did have some plays that were some throw. He had one throw in particular that was, I think Shaq Davis caught it that probably should have been picked off, but the defender didn't turn around. So, I mean, yeah, there were plays like that. But, I mean, I still think for this season, I think he's your guy as your backup. And, he's a guy that, he kind of talked about, the 31 other teams out there, and he thinks he's one of the best 32 quarterbacks in the league. So, there may be a team out there that would take a chance on him. I mean, he may be better than some of the other quarterbacks in the division, I would say. So, those are my thoughts about him.
Yeah, I mean, you look around the league and there's some bad starting quarterbacks. I mean, every year it's bad. So Jameis may be right in that, but he has not looked great. I did want to ask Rod. Luke mentioned Kendre Miller. What a phenomenal performance by him, at least at times. I mean, his overall numbers, as you see, weren't great. 2.3 yards per rush. He had like a loss of 5 on one play where Trevor Penning whiffed on a block. Other than that, I think he was pretty good. And then he caught that pass, followed it up with a run right up the gut for a touchdown. He really popped in this game after getting hurt the week before.
He did, and this is a guy that didn't catch a whole lot of passes at TCU, so just to see him be able to make that kind of catch was really impressive. And he's a guy that I think it was the first time we ever saw him. It was in rookie mini camp, and I just remember him walking on the field. He was still dealing with the injury, and just looking at him and just looking at his body, and you can just tell that he was probably going to be a special player. And I think he's a guy that, I don't know. I mean, I think Alvin Kamara still has, obviously a lot of good years left, but I think this is a guy that could definitely step in and fill those shoes once Kamara's time is up here.
Yeah. Wrap up the. Go ahead, Luke.
No, I was just going to say I agree with Rod. I think he's stepping into a really, really good situation where he doesn't have to come in and carry the ball 15, 20 times a game. He can come in and learn from a couple of really good, experienced running backs, and not put a bunch of wear and tear on his body for the time when it is his time, because there is going to come a time when Kendre Miller is the bell cow of somebody's offense. I think he's really got that potential to be the guy in a rushing attack.
Let's kind of wrap up the Chargers / LA portion of the preseason. Dunk, do you come back from LA, the Saints come back from LA more or less optimistic than you were when you started? I know that's a broad question, but let's start there.
Well, I got to tell you, I watched the game again this morning. It's the third time I've watched it. And then I went back and watched a lot of the the joint practices, and I came away feeling better about the Saints defense now. I feel pretty good. Like, I've got a pretty good beat on that group. That secondary is really strong. I think their linebackers are fine. I like Luke said, I think the addition of Jalen Smith kind of gives them a little more depth there that you can rely on. I still got some questions about the pass rush. I think that's the question about the defense. But I did see some good things out of the defense. I think they controlled their joint practices with the Chargers and probably had the upper hand there. Offensively, I think you've still got some question marks. Probably have a few more question marks than I had before we left. I think Trevor Penning is definitely a question mark early in the season. There's going to be some growing pains and pass protection, and we don't know yet who the other guard is going to be. Is it going to be James Hurst, or is it going to be Andres Pete? So I think you've got some legitimate questions about the line. The offensive playmakers certainly look like they're ready to go. I think the offense is going to be in good hands. It's going to be much improved from a year ago. So I'm a little bullish on the offense and on the defense, and I've got a few more questions than I had. They haven't run the ball all that well in these preseason games either. I wouldn't be surprised if that's what Pete Carmichael and Doug Marrone and Dennis Allen emphasized this week against the Texans, trying to get that ground game going. They seem to have focused a lot on the passing attack, synchronizing that. Wouldn't surprise me to see them try and get some runs established against Houston, because that's an area we haven't seen a lot of yet because they haven't tackled in practice and they just haven't done it a lot in these preseason games.
Yeah,
I'm curious, Luke, your impressions too.
Well, I think I'm gonna withhold judgment on the rushing attack for now, because I think they actually looked pretty solid when they had that first team offensive line out there against the Chiefs. Alvin Kamara had a pretty decent yards per carry average. Then they got those guys out of there, and it wasn't as good. I really want to see what they look like with that first team unit. We might not see it this week against the Texans. In fact, I'm kind of counting on not seeing it this week. But to Duncan's point, I mean, that is something they need to get going here, because 2 weeks in, they're averaging right around 2 yards per carry as a team. They need that part of the offense to be a strength, to get the most out of Derek Carr in this passing attack. I don't think they can just go out there and rely on Carr to zip it around 40 times a game. It's not it's not really the way they want to play ball, first of all, and I don't think that's going to get the most out of this offense. So it's something they got to figure out. I think I'm also a little bit, maybe a little bit more bullish on the pass rush than Duncan is. Shocker here. I think they're better than Jeff thinks they're going to be, but I've just seen so much just in glimpses in training camp of just explosion from that defensive interior, so much more than in recent years. And I think if you start adding rush from the interior part of the defensive line, that really is going to marry well with what they have on the edges and with their blitz packages, and it's also going to create more turnovers. And this is something we haven't talked about a lot, but they've created 5 in 2 weeks, and I think that's more than they had in the first 6 games of last season combined. They have 3 interceptions. That's more than they had the first 11 games of last season combined. So I think part of that is just going hand in hand with just getting some pressures on the quarterback and making him get rid of the ball before he wants to.
Yeah, I mean, look, the turnovers, the takeaways are certainly positive. As is winning 2 games. I mean, nobody's going to sit here and say that preseason games are predictive in any way, but the fact remains the Saints haven't started 2-0 in the preseason, Rod, in 9 years. And you kind of like to get that feeling in the locker room, I think, even if it's the backups and maybe it doesn't mean anything long term, but the feeling seems to be pretty optimistic.
Yeah, I mean, I think you want to win games. This is a franchise. They've never gone undefeated in the preseason, so they have a chance to do that. But obviously there's no correlation between preseason and the regular season. So there's a concern. But for me, just kind of going back to that game, my biggest concern, and I'm not sure if you were going to touch this later, but is the penalties. In 2 games, we're up to 23 penalties for 222 yards. And, this is something that plagued them at the beginning of last season. And something I was thinking about earlier was that the fact that this team hasn't had officials in practice. I don't think they've had them in practice here at all. They've had them, I guess, the 2 joint practices, the only time they've actually practiced with officials. So, a lot of times you may see a pass interference in practice and nobody knows it's a pass interference because nobody's really calling it. You just kind of like, we got the media on the sideline asking each other, like, you think those pass interference? And that's it. So I think you're starting to see some of that, I think, spill over into the games. And so I think it's something that they're going to really have to get fixed. And, having a joint practice this week probably would have helped that just because you get some more officiating. But so I think that's an area of concern. It's something that we probably should be talking about a little bit more about this team.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Obviously, that was a headline, 14 penalties. It had me looking up the Saints record for penalties in a game, which you can't really find preseason data, but in the regular season, the record was 17, and they had 14 with like 6 or 7 minutes left in the game. So they could have gotten there. They had a couple more at the end. They didn't, but Rod, you bring up a good point. Like, and it's a good transition before I do want to spend some time. The title of this podcast was talking about the roster cuts coming up in a week, but I do want to spend just a second, guys, on the Texans and Saints canceling the joint practices that were supposed to take place tomorrow and Thursday in New Orleans. They announced it as a mutual decision. I got the impression, and I don't know if y'all did too, but I got the impression that this was more of the Texans saying, hey, we really don't want to go through this week.
Yeah, that's what Dennis Allen said, that D'Amico Ryans actually called him. I guess they're just banged up, and I saw a couple other joint practices got canceled as well. It makes no sense if you're going to be going with your second string against the Saints' first string, which is what it sounded like would have been happening. So I think both sides said they weren't going to get anything out of it. What you want in these joint practices, your ones against ones, good against good, your twos against twos, and then you get a really good evaluation. And that wasn't going to be the case because the Texans were so banged up. I think both coaches would have loved to have done it, but it just wasn't going to work out on such short notice. And, I think really, and Luke and I talked about it post-game this past week. I mean, you go back and when you watch these joint practices, you really get a sense of the depth of each team, and you get a much better sense of where the team stands than what we watched on Sunday night. I mean, there was no regulars really on either side of the ball for the most part. So I almost feel like that's, other than trying to determine who's on the 53, I think it's almost meaningless to even talk about, to be honest with you.
I was actually looking forward to I was looking forward to seeing Will Anderson in practice this week. I got a chance to watch the Texans in there. I guess they were playing the Lions. I forgot who they were playing the other night, but he was really dominant. I just really wanted to see him and Trevor Penning. I know we keep talking about Trevor Penning, but I really want to see that matchup. And I know Luke wanted to see Sheldon Rankins, I'm sure. So that's his guy. So
I still might get a chance to poke over to the Texans locker room and catch him before he goes. Miss Sheldon around these parts.
Well, I think we'll get to probably see C.J. Stroud, because I'm assuming they're going to want to get him a few more reps, him being a rookie, but they may want to put him on ice just to not take any chances. But that's a guy that obviously needs to be on the fast track to get ready for the regular season.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I mean, I do think they lose something without these joint practices, and we can kind of go into Cutdown Day now. So instead, the Saints, they're going to practice here in a couple of hours, and then they practice the rest of the week, and they have the preseason game, and then you're basically at Cutdown Day. And they've got a lot of decisions to make. Rod, you wrote about the wide receivers this morning. You can find that on NOLA.com. We know, obviously, Chris Olave, Michael Thomas, Rashid Shaheed, assuming he's healthy, will be the starters. And then after that, it gets a little more difficult. And that's really the story at every position. The Saints are pretty solid at the top, and they do have some depth in some spots, but it kind of gets difficult at some places to decide. And Jeff, you did a 53-man roster projection before camp started. I'm not sure some of those decisions have gotten any easier from what we've seen the first month. No,
look, I think some guys have stepped forward and certainly earned spots. I mean, Rod wrote about Keith Kirkwood. I think Traquan Smith. I mean, I think they're going to run it back with those guys. Now, whether they keep 6 receivers, which they've done a lot in the past, that opens up the door for one of the young guys like A.T. Perry or Shaq Davis, something like that. I don't think Brian Edwards is going to make this team. And they've already released the other 2 veterans, Kiki Kuti and James Washington. So, I think that receiving corps, it's really going to come down to, is your 6th receiver as good as your 9th offensive lineman? Who's better? Or your 10th defensive back? That's really kind of the decisions that this comes down to. And look, we talked a little bit yesterday on social media about the kicker competition, but I think that's a real thing. Both guys have kicked extremely well. Will Lutz has been dynamite in camp, but so is this young kid, Blake Grupe. And if you're the brass here, the brain trust, and you think Sean Payton in Denver might give you a 6th-round draft pick for Will Lutz, are you confident enough to make that trade, get a low-round draft pick, and go with the young guy that's unproven over the sure thing and save a little money too? You'd save about $2 million, I think. Those are the decisions that Mickey Loomis and the brain trust with the Saints have got to make here in the next few weeks, and that's what they get paid the big bucks to do. But I don't think it would be a shock if the Saints somewhere in this next cut somebody that we're surprised like that, or make a trade to clear some room.
Yeah, that would be a shocker. But where else are you looking, Luke, for tough decisions on this roster cutdown?
I think some of the tougher decisions, just when I'm trying to put it together, are the depth spots at defensive back and on the offensive line. When you look at the offensive line, I think you see 6 that are definites, right? With the 5 starters, and pick Andres Peter or James Hurst as the 6th, the swing offensive lineman. I think you could probably look at Max Garcia, who's been their backup center throughout all of training camp, probably getting a spot on the team. And then after that, I think it starts to get kind of tough. I think Storm Norton's played pretty well, but he's a guy who's, they've been lining up pretty much primarily at right tackle. I don't know if you can count on him to be a swing tackle guy. Landon Young, I think, was having a pretty good camp, and then he got hurt. Calvin Throckmorton's obviously played a ton of football, but he's somebody whose grades don't always stack up to where you want, and maybe they want to try somebody else as that kind of swing guy on the inside. They got a lot of questions there that still need to be answered. And then I think in the defensive back room, I really like Ugo Amadi. I think he's somebody who can, kind of be that Justin Evans type who's plays a bunch of different positions. You can throw him in the slot, you can throw him at safety, but they also have guys like Lonnie Johnson back there, and I think Jordan Howden's going to earn a roster spot. So that takes away from one of these veterans. It's just there's a lot of kind of competition in the back end of that secondary. I think this week's going to be really important for those guys.
Yeah, Smoke Monday, another one back there who's flashed a couple of times, but somebody's got to go. And so, Rod, you circle back to the receivers because you wrote about them. That's one spot where Brian Edwards again looks like he's on the outside looking in. There's somebody else who's had a pretty good preseason who's probably not going to make it between. Whether it's Shaq Davis or Jontre Kirkland or one of these guys is going to be exposed to other teams picking him up.
Yeah, and I think one of the guys I'm interested to see what they do with Traquan Smith. He's a guy that's battled some injuries, and I had him, listed pretty high on that list today when I was ranking the other guys. I had Kirkwood first and Traquan right after him, and that was just because, when we hear Dennis Allen talk, he really raves about the things that Traquan does, and it's a lot of things that most fans probably don't really appreciate, but he does a lot of blocking, and when they're able to spring some of those long runs, it's a lot of times it's because of what Traquan is able to do out there. But I mean, he's been out since August the 5th, I believe it is, hadn't practiced, and you don't know how much that sets him back. But I do know that Dennis Allen and Cody Burns seem to really like him, and so I think he comes back to the team. You have guys like Jontre Kirkland who hadn't been here long, and I think he's kind of showed some flashes. He's been on the return team, is done well on kickoff returns, and he had Jake Haener. He caught Jake Haener's first pass on Sunday, and he's made some plays. But I think when you look at him and you look at Lynn Bowden, I mean, those guys kind of do the same thing as far as being able to help you out in both return and receiving. So it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out at that position.
Yeah, I think those guys are going to get a long look on this weekend. The guys you just mentioned, I think they're going to try and use this game against the Texans to determine who the return guy is. If you're going to not lean on Rashid Shaheed on returns, then that opens the door for, Bowden or maybe Jontre Kirkland. And I think that gives them the upper hand on someone like just a Shaq Davis who's trying to make it but isn't also a returner. And I also think you have to consider like Kirk Merritt into the equation, because even though he's a running back now by trade, I think how he does on special teams compared to how Kirkland and Bowden do on special teams, that's the decisions they're trying to make right now in those personnel meetings is, do we want to keep Bowden or do we want to keep Merritt, and who helps us more on special teams? It's less about the position than the special teams contributions.
And I think the same thing for linebacker. I mean, there are going to be some of those guys that I think Jalen Smith has probably already done enough that we can kind of pencil him in one of those linebacker spots. But I mean, you look at those guys like Zach Bond and Nephi Sewell and DeMarco Jackson. I mean, those guys, I don't know how many lines keep, but I mean, special teams could really go a long way in helping those guys earn a spot as well.
Yeah, 100%. Luke had a slight technical difficulty with the laptop, but he's back with us.
Yeah, traveling all day from LA, and I did not plug my laptop in last night, so we had to switch venues here. Get some juice, because I know you guys I know you need to hear what I say on this podcast. I'm the most important one here. Everybody knows that.
Well, look, other than Luke's
no
snark,
argument.
The linebacker position, the guy that's opened eyes a little bit is this Connolly guy. I think he's got a real shot to make the roster now because of his special teams work. Like you said, he's flashed and he's not afraid to stick his head in there and his nose in there and make a play at linebacker. And they're looking for, I think, another spark on special teams, and he's certainly got flashed.
And then the other guy, who had 3 sacks in the fourth quarter was Nico Lalos, who I don't think anybody even knew who that guy was going into Sunday, at least not, beyond beat reporters and diehards. So he's trying to make decisions tough too. I don't know that there's a spot for him, but
yeah, it's I was talking to Jeff about this the other day. It's weird when a guy has, in the span of a quarter has 3 sacks and 4 tackles for loss and a pass breakup, and we're not even talking about whether he pushed his way onto a roster spot. He's a guy who, for those who don't know, he spent some time with the Saints last year on the practice squad, went out and played some in the XFL, and they brought him back. And he's a guy who's just like he's kind of consistent, and they know what they're going to get out of him. But it's hard on this team, and just with the amount of resources they've piled into that defensive end room, for him to really make to have a legitimate shot at making this team, unless somebody got hurt. You look at this defensive end room right now, and you can pretty clearly say there's 5 guys who are going to make the team no matter what. It's Cam Jordan, Peyton Turner, Carl Granderson, Tano Passanio, and Isaiah Foskey. And that doesn't really leave a lot of room for guys like Nico Lalos. But I do think that he's somebody who just is very clearly a practice squad candidate, somebody who they can elevate on game day if they need to. And I think the same goes for some of these other guys that we're talking about. Unless he just goes out there and has a crazy game on Sunday, Shaq Davis is like a guy who feels like an ideal practice squad candidate for me. Somebody they can bring in and let him learn and refine his skills and technique a little bit, much the same way they did with Rashid Shaheed last year. And maybe, after a little bit more seasoning, he's a guy who can come in and make some plays for him, especially if somebody gets hurt. But that's kind of, I think, what a lot of guys are playing for on Sunday.
Yeah, and we'll be back with you on this podcast feed and YouTube channel on Thursday, and we'll preview that Texans game a little more closely. In the meantime, guys, to wrap things up, what do you look for in the next few days of practice? We're kind of in those dog days of camp where, again, unless you're one of those guys fighting for a spot on the 53, maybe there's not a ton to wrap up. I mean, one thing I know, it'd be nice to see Demario Davis back at practice. It'd be nice to see Andres Pete back practicing in full. I mean, is there a chance we see those guys on Sunday if they're healthy, just they get a couple reps?
I don't think we see Demario. I just don't. I mean, he's been around, and both of them have been around, but you may want to get Pete out there just to, they need a little bit more cohesion, I guess, on the offensive line. But I definitely don't think you see Demario.
No, but I do think Pete's situation is one to watch, because at some point they're going to have to make a call on who's starting. And James Hurst is a guy we know they like, they value. He's been out there with the ones almost the whole time since Pete's been out. And just for continuity's sake, the fact that we see him working so much with Trevor Penning right now, they may have to make a decision on that. So I do think, and he was back with them out in Costa Mesa on the sidelines in a jersey, wasn't really practicing, but he was out there. So I think that's a good sign that he's close to coming back. And I'm sure they want to get him on the field as soon as they can to kind of start working with that front 5 to get some cohesion with Derek Carr.
Yeah, I'm with you guys on that. I mean, that's the biggest thing I'm looking out for this week is just seeing who's out there, who's starting to make their way back to the team. There's a lot of guys right now who are kind of expected to be big contributors who didn't even practice when they were playing the Chargers out in LA and during joint practices. So I want to see if this is the week we see Demario Davis back in practice, Andres Pete, maybe Taysom Hill. Cesar Ruiz was out last week, and maybe this week isn't the one Rashid Shaheed comes back, but he was out there working on the sidelines too, and I'm sure they want to get him some at least practice reps before they're throwing him back out there for week 1. So really, team health is the biggest thing right now. I think there's only a handful of spots on this roster that are really truly up for grabs right now. So let's get the big guys back out there and see what this Saints team can do this year.
And look, another guy we haven't talked about at all is Jimmy Graham. I mean, what's going to happen with that situation? I don't think anybody knows the answer, but it's certainly something to monitor. I know he's going to probably get some medical tests this week, but I don't think anyone knows his future, including himself. But there's a possibility that he's played his last down of football. We don't know that yet. It might not be that severe, but it's certainly, I think, something to consider, considering the medical issue he's encountered and where the Saints stand with putting him back on the field. I don't think they feel comfortable, certainly not right now, until they get some answers on that.
And one more guy.
I'm glad you brought that up.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. You can go ahead.
So, sorry, Rod. I was just going to say, I'm glad you brought that up because, look, if Jimmy Graham, was taken into custody, he was technically, I guess, arrested on Saturday morning in L.A., wandering around the streets. It turned out to be a medical issue, a seizure, that sort of thing. I mean, and playing NFL football is not what you want to do if you're in that condition, I wouldn't think. I mean, I'm not a doctor, don't know what his doctors will say. Maybe there was another, side effect from medication. I mean, I'm totally speculating, but we don't know. But I think you're right, Dunk. I mean, I think there's a possibility that the doctors say, look, going out there and playing collision football is not what you need right now in your life.
Yeah, no, I think all the options are on the table right now, but there's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unanswered questions. And when I talked to people with the Saints on Sunday night, no one was talking about, let's get him back out to practice as soon as possible. I mean, it was more like, hey, we don't know what's going to happen. And I think that's exactly how you should be looking at something that serious. I do know that there's a track record here that hasn't been reported, but like they're finding out there's been some issues like that in his past. It's wasn't just a one-time thing. So I think that's the concern is, how much is this treatable? Is it treatable, or is it something that doctors are going to have to make a decision on?
Rod,
you had something to add, I think.
Yeah, it wasn't about Jimmy, but I just wanted to, as a player that we haven't really talked about, but and something else I think we should be watching this week is Marshawn Lattimore. I mean, he left practice last week with some kind of, tweaked his knee or something. And I mean, he's a guy that this team definitely needs to have to be successful. And I mean, it may not be anything big, but I'd be curious this week to see, how much he's out there in practice and what is he able to do.
Yep, absolutely. So another good point. We'll wrap things up there. These guys have a busy afternoon in front of them and a busy week. Saints practice every day through Friday. Texans on Sunday at the Dome. And we will be back with you on the Saints Insider podcast on Thursday. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. You get notifications when we go live, and you can add your own comments and questions. We had one from Hemisphere. Could we see more Haener against the Texans? I think absolutely. In fact, maybe he plays the whole game like Easton Stick did for the Chargers on Sunday. So you'll definitely see more Jake Haener. We'll talk more about that Texans game. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. Sign up for notifications. And also, if you are on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, leave us a review. We'd love to hear what you have to say. So until then, for Rod Walker, Luke Johnson, and Jeff Duncan, I'm Zach Ewing, and this has been the Saints Insider Podcast.